Welcome to Inventory. My name is Paul, and this is a series delving into the inner workings and backstories of game-defining objects with the creators that made them. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the radio from Firewatch with Nels Anderson, who was one of the designers on the game. This is an object that appears in a whole host of games in various forms, whether as a walkie-talkie, as in this game, or as a telephone, an in-ear communication device, or some other variation on the theme. In Firewatch, however, it plays a particularly important role. Set in the wilderness of Wyoming in 1989, the game has you playing as a firewatchman named Henry, who, because of the nature of the job he is doing in this vast natural landscape, doesn't come into contact with other people. This leaves the radio with a lot of work to do. Almost everything is filtered through it, and by extension, through Henry's conversations with his supervisor, Delilah. You need a reason beyond boredom to venture out into the wilderness and an idea of where to go. The radio gives you reasons to do that. After you've visited a location, it provides a means to feed back on your experiences. It's almost the only means for which the game can build Henry and Delilah as characters, develop their story, give you insights into their emotional states, and do everything else that a story-based game like this needs to do. One of the things I found particularly interesting about the way the radio is used in this game is that it brings out the contradictions inherent to the object. It's a device for communication, a means to connect to someone, yet because it's an object that necessarily means you're communicating over a distance and only allows you to communicate through voice, cutting out other means of communication like body language or facial expressions, this means it offers a way of maintaining an emotional or personal distance too, a way of blocking or at least stalling connection at a certain point, leaving all kinds of gaps for potential deception, deliberate or otherwise. Given that Henry is someone who has taken on this job as a way of seeking isolation, of disconnecting from people and trying to reorientate himself, it makes sense that this device would be the one through which he begins to reconnect, offering distance and protection as he slowly opens himself up. I asked Nels if this was why the radio was in the game, and following a theme that I'm finding to be common as I talk to game designers about the objects they've designed, he explained that while the radio plays the kind of role I outlined, the route to getting there was more complex than having an idea and then implementing it. It also emerged out of practical production considerations, which ended up informing the game's themes and its design.
We knew that there's no way a small team making an independent video game could afford to have a character that was modeled and would walk around and talk and all this stuff. So we're like, okay, we need some way for there to be somebody. There needs to be another voice in the game, so you're not just like a weirdo monologuing out in the woods to yourself the whole time for the entire video game, right? And it's like, oh, well, if someone's on the other end of a handheld radio, okay, the production cost there is voice acting, but that's it. But of course, it makes sense in the setting where indeed, these people, actual fire lookouts, are out in the bloody woods by themselves for long stretches of time, and the only other communication they have is through radios, right? So it was just those two things happened to line up together, and the details of any of that, who Henry was, who initially she was even called Alice, as like Delilah's placeholder name was Alice, until eventually that became Delilah, and where all of that came out of was figured out after just a basic you're a guy in a fire lookout tower. We can't afford to have anybody else there, but we can talk over a radio. Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of those things where, the production practical constraints feed into, okay, what do we want to do, thematically, which feeds back into more okay, but then we can do this. Oh, but then it all, at least in my experience making games, very rarely is it just from on high, you have the tablets and you're thematically, the game will be about this. That will dictate these exact mechanics. And I mean, maybe some people can make video games that way. I have never seen it. I certainly can't do it. But it ended up being the case where it's okay, well, this is what we've got. What does that mean? What can we do here? And then just kind of it cycling and feeding into itself.
On the face of it, the radio is very simple and intuitive. You hold down a button to hold the radio up in game and scroll between different conversation options you want to select. To return to another common theme that's coming up in this series, my suspicion that this simplicity belies the complexity of getting the object working as intended behind the scenes was confirmed.
It's one of those things that like it seems simple, but it's, I mean, nothing in a video game is ever simple ever. It's a miracle that any of them ever exist. Even just stuff about like the reticle, right? Think about like, okay, you got this targeting reticle, but also in the game, we obviously have a notion of like an interaction distance, right? So if you're like, 50 meters away from a thing that's like technically not called off the screen, okay, but you can't like actively target it to talk about it. But then, if it's like, well, should the reticle become active like only right when you touch the radius? Because then if you're right on the edge, you're kind of flickering and that doesn't feel good. So I'm pretty sure there's like entering into the radius is slightly bigger than the outside. So then you get like the reticle slightly changes when you're kind of close to a thing. Just be like, hey, here's a thing you potentially could talk to, but you need to get a little bit closer to actually talk to it. Just like everything from every single bit of the internet. It's like, how do you control it, right? It's like, okay, well, when it's like effectively like you bring up the iron sights of your radio to be like, okay, I think I'm going to talk about this thing. Okay, but maybe not, right? So it's like, okay, well, you have to be able to target the thing, bring up the radio, which is like looking on the iron sights of your proverbial conversation rifle. You see the options, but then it's like, okay, well, then should it be like 1, 2, 3 to select the options? And eventually we opted for like a scrolling thing, and then it's like holding down the button brings the conversation like selector up, but if you release it, it goes down because that was meant to feel like the way that like push to talk on a radio does, right? As compared to most conversation systems in a game where it's like, oh, well, when you open up the conversation tree, okay, then it's open and it stays open. But in this case, we wanted to evoke that kind of like, hold the button, I'm talking, I release the button to hear what the other person says. There's all kinds of just like very small considerations like that.
One of the things I was interested in learning is how the team dealt with the question of how much and when the player should be allowed to talk. Conversation is important for pushing the story forward, but it's also clear that there are times where you're meant to feel a degree of isolation. How did the team decide what and when the players should be able to talk about and ensure that they could provide space between dialogue?
I mean, there end up being basically two modes of radio conversation in the game. There's, you targeted an object and you want to, or some entity in the world, right? And you want to talk about that thing. Okay, there's actually kind of three. So there's like a thing in the world, you want to talk about it. So you look at like the campfire that the teens left or whatever, right? And you're like, okay, here's a specific thing that if I want to, I can talk to Delilah about this by targeting it. But then we have this additional challenge where it's like, okay, well, we don't want to sign up for like, we never wanted there to be for both practicals, just like, oh God, how do we even provide an experience in this that's coherent, but also for some more thematic reasons. We never wanted there to be just like an arbitrary, like, push to talk to Delilah about whatever button, right? But then there is kind of this, we discovered in just trying to make stuff for the video game, that there's this weird like intermediate space where it's like, okay, well, there are going to be things you want to talk about that aren't necessarily strictly tied to like a physical object in the world. So we had to invent this like, okay, there's like spatial subjects of conversation, and then there's like contextual temporal ones where, if you remember, there's like a little like UI thing that shows up on the side of the screen where it's like, talk to Delilah about the thunder you just heard or whatever, where there isn't strict, because we didn't want to hem ourselves in exclusively to like, oh, there has to be, an actual artifact right here in front of you to talk about, right? And then, completely separate from that, we're like, okay, well, it can't be entirely player-driven either, because it's very hard to tell a story when, if the only way you ever interacted with Delilah was by, holding down the shift button to talk to her about some stuff, one, that'd be kind of weird. Because then she'd just be like this robot that only exists when you decide to talk to her. But also, it's like, well, what kind of story are we telling if the player just opts out completely about talking about anything ever, right? So then there are just places in the game where either, based on some space in the world or based on a time thing or blah, 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 that she'll just call you up and be like, hey, Henry, have you blah, 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 right? And so those ended up being like the three modes of interaction. But since we never opted for, okay, well, you can just push a button to just like have a conversation the way you'd like, if you just like in some, I don't know, RPG where you just like, there's a town full of NPCs and you could walk up to any of them and just hit like the A button to talk to them. We didn't want to provide that kind of interaction. And so I think that gave us the kind of tools we needed to have a density of stuff to talk about where it was appropriate, but then also have moments of like, you're just kind of out walking in the woods by yourself. to get to a place. And usually in those situations, like the music will come up, and then you get kind of those I'm a little bit alone moments. And that was just kind of like our tool chest of stuff we could do to just lay out, like, okay, well, how do we want the conversational density in this chunk of the game to be?
A lot of this conversation with Nels has been about finding answers to questions about the design of the radio that I'd considered based on what the game was trying to do, what I found effective about its design, and so on. But one of the most interesting parts of my conversation with Nels was finding out about something that hadn't come to my mind at all: the problem of creating dialogue that makes sense in the context of a story that takes place over a long period of time, 79 days to be precise.
The game has, I don't know how many people, it feels this way if you play it, but the game kind of has, a Metroidvania structure, and this was not an accident, where the amount of, the game is, the actual physical spaces you can get to in the world are gated by you getting specific items, right? But it's not, you never get, a cool double jump or anything. It's just kind of oh, you get this bag of ropes that now you can clip onto these things. But that means that the amount of world that someone can actually access is relatively constrained at any particular chunk of the game. So it's you can get lost, but you can get lost kind of just in this other smaller area, and that's fine. You're never going to end up on the complete opposite side of the map and have no idea what to do. And that was both for just how are we going to unfold people's experience of the game, but also very much for story purposes, right? If you could end up in the scout camp on day one, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense and be kind of weird. I mean, we already had to do so much juggling because the game, unlike so many other first-person narrative exploration games, walking simulators, whatever you want to call them, almost all of those, you are basically a combination between a detective and an archaeologist, right? Where whatever happened in this space has happened. And you, as the person playing the video game, and probably the character in the video game, are just there to figure out, well, what went on. But there's no plot or story that's actively unfurling in the moment. Not really, right? But Firewatch is completely goddamn different, where you're an active participant in the story, literally day 42, right? But what that means is that when you see some particular object in the game, and you want to talk to Delilah about it, if you're talking to her about it on day one, where you two barely know each other, versus day 78, where all this other crazy stuff has gone on and blah, 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 then the context of that is so different that you can't just play the same voice line, or it would be bananas, right? It just wouldn't make any sense, where, the kind of conversations you have with someone who you've gotten to know over the course of 2.5 months versus your kind of boss that you met, 3 hours ago, are completely different, let alone the actual context that may be informed by the plot events of the story itself. So there's also all this state management under the hood to ensure that that stuff is coherent. And so it was also an additional perk / necessity of us gating off specific chunks of the world. It's okay, when someone is in this area, we know that in time, they're either on day 78 or 79, and that's it. So we only kind of need to cover those situations, plus all the other stateful stuff that may have changed, but not literally the full scope of this entire story from beginning to end. So there was a myriad of reasons why the world is laid out the way it is.
I'm going to say one more time that the radio in Firewatch has again revealed a theme that's already come up in previous episodes of the series. While we can see a lot of what makes the radio significant to the game and what makes it effective in terms of telling a story and developing the game's characters, there's a lot that we don't see. No more so, I would suggest, than the way the radio has shaped the environment around it, requiring the game's designers to structure your access to that environment to take into account the fact that this object allows you to communicate. I think that this is just more proof that any object important to gameplay ends up exerting demands on the game's designers in all kinds of surprising and unanticipated ways. Whatever it is any given object does has huge implications for everything that surrounds it.